So we know these new things out of Georgia, Fulton County. What does this tell us?
Yeah, so all 4 indictments are now in. It's a lot. So let's take a moment. Let's assess where we are and what's next. Of course, Fulton County is the newest one. So what's happening in that case? The judge has given the parties until August 25th to surrender. I should say the DA has given the defendants until August 25th, next Friday, to surrender. That's the easy way. If they do that, they come in themselves, they're processed. If anybody does not surrender by then the DA has the right to send out law enforcement officials to make an arrest. We'll see if anyone tries to press that. The other big issue, and we just said this word, removal. Get ready for a lot of talk about removal. Mark Meadows is already trying to do this. Donald Trump will try to follow. In a nutshell, what this means is if a federal official gets charged with a state crime that relates to that federal official's official job duties, you can get the case moved.
Like being president or chief of staff?
Right. Within the legitimate scope of those jobs, important qualification, you can get the case moved over to federal court and then potentially dismissed. So these are really important motions. Mark Meadows has already done this. Trump is sure to follow. The other thing that we're watching for here is we have 19 defendants in this case. That's a lot. And a lot of these folks are facing criminal charges for the first time. Are people going to try to save themselves, cooperate, and flip? And if so, are they going to be able to take prosecutors up and up this essentially hierarchy chart? Watch and see if anyone starts pleading guilty. Watch and see if there's any cooperation agreements or what we call an information, which sort of would indicate cooperation.
A lot of what's in the Georgia indictment is part of Jack Smith's, one of his most recent indictment. Walk us through those two. Well, there's 3 other outstanding cases.
Yeah, so now we're into the federal cases. This is Jack Smith's 2020 election interference case. The big issue there is, what will the trial date be? Now, DOJ last week put in a brief asking for January 2nd, 2024. Pretty aggressive time frame. Trump has not responded yet. His response is due later this week. I think it's fair to say he's going to want later, maybe never, certainly after the election. And then the judge is holding a hearing to decide the trial date and other scheduling issues on August 28th, a week from Monday. Now, the other Jack Smith federal case, now we're talking about the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case. They are going through how are we going to handle classified documents. Now, remember, DOJ returned a superseding indictment, a sort of version 2.0, where they added this third defendant, Mr. De Oliveira, and added 3 charges against Donald Trump. And so the question is that going to compromise the May 2024 trial date? Again, the dynamic, Trump's going to want to push back. DOJ is going to say, let's keep it. And then finally, let's not forget the first of the cases to land, the Manhattan DA's case about the hush money payments. They're going through pretrial motions, and they have a trial date of March of 2024.
Calendar?
Okay, look how wide open 2024 is. This looks great. We have an election in November of 2024. New York, the hush money case. Their trial is scheduled for March. That's definitely going to go through April. Mar-a-Lago, the Florida case we were talking about, that is set for trial starting in May. That's going to go into July. Now, where are the other cases going to fit? Let's take Jack Smith's January 6th case. They want to start it in January. They do not have enough time to get that in before the New York case. And then we have Fani Willis's case. There's no place for that.
Because you can't go so close to the election.
They're not going to start. If they start a trial in August, that's going to run right through the key months of the general election. There's no way we're going to have
Especially a RICO case.
Especially a RICO case. So I don't see any room for Fani Willis's case before the election. Even Jack Smith's case, someone's going to have to get rid of this case. I mean, Alvin Bragg, the DA on the New York case.
You mean move it?
Move it, yes. Not dismiss it, but move it. Let's be clear. Alvin Bragg has said publicly, he's on a little bit of a PR campaign where he said, hey, if I have to try to come off this trial date to accommodate the others, I'm willing to try to do that.
All right, Elie, thank you so much. We'll get more with you in a little bit. Phil.
Well, the only thing keeping pace with Trump's mounting legal woes are apparently the strategies to defend him. Here's a sampling of how some of Trump's allies are responding to this Georgia indictment.
Imagine if this had been applied to Al Gore's supporters when he contested Florida in 2000. This is a direct threat to the American system of the rule of law.
There were alternate electors sent in 1876. There were alternate ones sent in 1960. On advice of counsel, Trump asked Pence to kick it back to the states for recertification, whereas state legislatures are constitutionally empowered to determine elections. That's called politics.
Alternate electors had legal precedent of being selected and chosen in the Kennedy-Nixon 1960 election.
Joining us now, CNN political analyst and senior political correspondent for the New York Times, Maggie Haberman. Maggie, there's a lot to dig into here, but one of the things I want to start with, and I think the team and Poppy knows, I've been talking about this all morning, and I think yesterday afternoon and last night too, is the alleged report that the former president has decided he's going to release. It's definitely going to definitively lay out fraud that everyone and their mother and every court has repeatedly said is not true. The intent behind this, what is it?
So my colleague Jonathan Swan and I reported yesterday that a number of Trump's aides and allies woke up yesterday, several hours after he had been indicted, in Georgia for allegedly trying to subvert the election and being part of a conspiracy to do so, to find that he had posted this social media posting saying there is going to be a major news conference on Monday where he is going to show this report. We dug into it. We learned that Liz Harrington, a Trump aide who works in communications, at least in part compiled what is more than a 100-page report about Georgia, specifically, as we understand it, and about what she believes and what he believes, despite all kinds of evidence to the contrary, is widespread fraud in that race, and that this is what he was going to move forward with. It's unclear whether this press conference goes forward, but that's what it refers to. And Phil, we should note, just to the point that you guys were just making about the various layers of his legal travails here, Liz Harrington is an aide who shows up, albeit unnamed, in another of the indictments that Trump is facing, the one related to Mar-a-Lago documents. She was in the room, according to multiple people, when Trump was brandishing what he described as a secret military document that he could have declassified as president.
Your piece with Jonathan is so interesting this morning. The headline is Trump taunts test limits of release. And you're right, Mr. Trump is now probing the limits of what the criminal justice system will tolerate and the lines that Judge Tanya Chutkan sought to lay out about what he can and cannot say. He is really pushing here in a way that could really hurt him in terms of how this trial is conducted, when this trial is conducted.
So Judge Chutkan, and he has been attacking prosecutors and other judges in these various cases, but Judge Chutkan, who oversees the J6 case against him at the federal level, warned at a hearing on Friday with the two parties that there was clearly going to be a limit to Trump's free speech. Now, his lawyers and his advisors argue he's the frontrunner for the Republican nomination. He's a political candidate. He should have a fair amount of leeway because of that. And she was suggesting there are going to be limits despite that, because the laws of the court have to come first. He went within a short time of that hearing and began posting on Truth Social, his social media website, other people's posts, I guess we'd call them truths, about Judge Chutkan, adding some of his own commentary. Generally, it was other people's. One included a very large picture of her. And so he is very clearly testing the terms of his release, both in that case and I would say with these attacks on prosecutors, in others. Poppy, some lawyers say, and we talk about this in the piece, other defendants, if they were doing similar things, would be in jail. Now, it's very complicated to think of something like that happening to somebody with a Secret Service detail, but there is the question of, will the judge or the prosecutors seek some kind of recourse as he continues to talk?
Well, she did threaten to move it up the more he talks about, not the personal threats, but about, discovery.
Right. What she suggested was that she may be forced to preserve the sanctity of the jury pool and witnesses. She may be forced to move the trial date up sooner if this continues. And so we'll see if the government tries to suggest that he has already breached that.
Maggie, for the last several months, probably longer, there's been a lot of speculation about Mark Meadows, his role in all of this, regardless of the special counsel investigation or the Georgia investigation. He was obviously indicted in the Georgia case. He moved alone yesterday, or his legal team moved alone yesterday to try and shift things from state court to federal court. I was interested in the fact that he did it by himself. He didn't do it with any of the other 18 indicted co-conspirators, including the former president, and then he moved first. What's your sense of that dynamic right now?
I think the moving first was significant, and I think that you are going to see a pretty aggressive defense by Mark Meadows in that case. I think that they are trying to lay down a marker that this ought to be in federal court. I'm not really surprised, Phil, that it was only him. I don't think that in a RICO case where defendants are arguing they're not part of a conspiracy, that they all want to necessarily move together. I think that Meadows is going to make a specific argument as a former chief of staff. But as you note, Meadows is a focus of specific attention for a lot of people. For people around Trump, because people have wondered what he has said. For prosecutors, because he's one of the people who knew a lot. Now, he clearly was not especially helpful to investigators in Georgia. I mean, you can just read the indictment and see that. But I think you are going to see him try to argue very extensively that he should not have to face trial in a state court in Georgia.
Does it indicate anything to you, though, that he was not indicted in Jack Smith's probe about January 6th, and he is indicted here just in terms of cooperation?
I don't want to speculate about what he may or may not have done in other cases. We know that with January 6th House Select Committee, he partially cooperated. He turned over thousands of texts and then would not give an interview. Here, he does not seem to have done a whole hell of a lot, although, as I understand it, he had been brought in, I think, at some point by prosecutors. He is very apparent in the federal indictment. As you say, there are scenes that relate to him, but he was not indicted. But a number of people, Poppy, were not indicted by Jack Smith in that case. And so I would like to see where this goes as we go forward.